Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Mandana Rabi, and I'm the Vice President of Global Technical Services and Chief Technical Advisor at Nutrition International. NI is an international organization based in Canada with the generous support of the Global Affairs Canada and other donors. And we lead nutrition programming in 10 countries that are focal countries in Africa and Asia, and beyond that across different interventions related to nutrition. As an evidence-based organization, we are dedicated to bringing the state-of-the-art evidence to generate action for the most in need, especially adolescent girls, women, and children in the developing world. With this webinar, we are marking the first in a series of collaboration activities of Nutrition International and the Society for Implementation Science in Nutrition under the Strengthening Global Nutrition Impact Through Collaboration initiative. This is an initiative to support individuals and organizations to make greater use of implementation science to improve program implementation and impact in nutrition. On behalf of NI, especially my colleagues at the Global Technical Services team who were leading the development of this webinar with SISN, I would like to welcome all of you today and wish that the learnings from this event will serve nutrition programming in future for all of us and provide a good model for more joint events like this in future. Thank you very much for being here today and looking forward to a very fruitful conversation. I'm handing over to my colleague for the formal start of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Mandana. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Chaudhary Jalal, and I'm the Senior Technical Advisor, Evaluation and Strategic Research at Nutrition International. And I also am the SISN Continuous Education and Capacity Building Counselor. It's my pleasure to moderate today's webinar, From Innovation to Scale Up, Potential of Pulses Fortification to Improve Micronutrient Malnutrition in Nutrition International's program and beyond. Second slide up. Through presentations, experts' opinion, and audience interactions, we hope to gain a better understanding of the importance of pulses as a vehicle for fortification. Second, trade, marketing, policy, and industry considerations in pulse fortifications, application of lessons learned from other fortification in the design and implementation of pulse fortification, relevancy of implementation science for pulse fortification planning and programming, and implementation considerations and future opportunities for pulse fortification. So you might be thinking, why pulses? Well, hopefully at the end of this session, that will be apparent. Our colleagues will provide more information in their presentations, but I would like to begin by touching upon 4 important reasons why we're so excited about the future of the pulse fortification. First, pulses are considered to be a powerhouse of nutrients. Pulses have a high protein content in the range of 19 to 33% and having a huge potential to achieving food security worldwide. Pulses are also an important source of energy and dietary fiber with a very low glycemic index. Second, global availability of pulses has been increasing since 2000, especially in the low and middle income countries. Third, pulses are an inexpensive source of protein, a crucial component of any healthy diet, but especially in the poorer areas where animal source protein is economically less accessible. Fourth, pulses are a climate smart source of protein. By fixing atmospheric nitrogen and solubilizing phosphates, pulses contribute to reducing the need for synthetic fertilizers. With that, now we are going to move to the presentations. But before that, there is a little bit of housekeeping. Today's webinar is scheduled for 90 minutes, which we intend to divide into 3 sections. First section will be the presentations from 3 speakers, followed by the second period where we will ask our 6 panelists to reflect on the presentations and share their insights. And finally, we will conclude with a question and answer session, which will be open to all the audience. If you have any questions during the presentations or panel discussion, please type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the webinar. I will pose as many questions as possible to our speakers and panelists as the time allows. If you experience any technical issues, please also type your questions in the question box. Our colleague Naomi will help us address these. A big thank you to Naomi for supporting from behind the screen. We're also active on Twitter, and we encourage you to chat and engage with us through our Twitter hashtag, which will appear in the chat box. Finally, a recording of the webinar will be made available to all at the end of the session. Now, without any further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, my colleague Manpreet Shada. Manpreet is the Senior Technical Advisor for Food Fortification at Nutrition International. She provides technical assistance and quality assurance for the programs that involve Food Fortification in Nutrition International. Additionally, Manpreet monitors global progress, leads in knowledge management in this area, and represents Nutrition International as donors, panelists, working groups, and partners. Over to you, Manpreet.
Thank you so much, Jalal. Through my presentation, I'm going to present to you the frontiers in pulses fortification and highlight the knowns and unknowns to promote fortification of pulses as an intervention. But first, let's look at the bigger picture and review the world's food and nutrition situation. Although the world produces enough food to feed its entire population, food insecurity still has been rising since 2014. Over 1.5 billion people can't even afford a diet that meets the required levels of essential nutrients. And all of these people who lack access to regular healthy diets, they live in all regions of the world, a global issue that affects all of us. And as we know, COVID-19 is expected to worsen this trend. As the governments around the world face the immediate and long-term implications of this pandemic, nutrition must play an integral role in the response. Fortification of regularly consumed foods presents an opportunity to reach millions of people with the much-needed micronutrients that improve health and strengthen immune systems. Now let's talk about food fortification, understand the gains thus far, and the unfinished agenda. Food fortification has been endorsed as a sustainable and cost-effective intervention to reach populations at large with essential micronutrients globally, with proven public health, human capital, and economic impacts. Currently, close to 150 countries worldwide have guidance or regulations in place for fortification programs, majority of them being mandatory. Still, food fortification is far from meeting its potential for impact at global scale, and the need for innovations to maximize the impact has been talked about for some time now. Fortification of pulses is one such innovation that considers the potential of pulses as a new food to deliver essential micronutrients to millions of people globally, including in low and middle income settings where pulses consumption has been on an increase. My colleague Jalal has already talked about the nutritional value of pulses, why they make a great vehicle for food fortification, and what are some of the challenges to keep in mind. So I'm not going to repeat these points, and I'm going to move directly to my next slide. Globally, we have been promoting fortification of staple grains. But what is important is to understand what makes pulses different from these staples. Pulses are a much better source of amino acids and dietary fiber and much lower in glycemic index as compared to cereal pulses. Another important consideration is the low per capita consumption of pulses. Average global consumption of pulses in 2014 was close to 21 grams per capita per day, and it varies by countries. WHO and FAO have been emphasizing the importance of increasing the intakes of several plant-based foods, including legumes and pulses, to promote healthy diets. So depending upon the context, especially the country context, there is an opportunity to promote pulses consumption, unlike that for staples and condiments, and we all understand that has been a concern for us. Even at the current consumption levels, potential of fortified pulses to make an impact is really promising. We know that program impact pathways help to understand program designs and also improve their delivery utilization and potential for impact. For pulses fortification as a new intervention, it will be important to design a program framework while assessing its components along this program impact pathway for fortification. To explore the program framework for pulses fortification, it is important to answer the critical question, the 5 Ws and 1 H, and also assess program components along this program impact pathway. Now let's take a quick look at these questions that will help us assess the scope and design this intervention. So first of all, why the need for a micronutrient intervention in general and food fortification intervention in particular? What could be the potential of pulses fortification in terms of reach, impact, and from an optimal mix of interventions perspective as a part of a multi-sectoral approach? Next, who do we intend to reach, or who actually can we reach with fortified pulses? Moving on, when do we consider ourselves ready to transition from one stage to the next, say from program planning to implementation and to eventually scale up? And where does this intervention make sense? The region, the countries, the geographies that present maximum potential for reach and impact. And lastly, how best can we reach the intended groups, assessing different business and operational models, keeping pulses, availability, trade dimensions, and delivery platforms in mind. This slide here really talks about program planning. And we understand designing a strong and thoughtful program impact pathway calls for a thorough understanding of the landscape. The colored boxes on the left side present the factors that need to be assessed to have a strong program design for pulses fortification as an intervention. We need to collect information on the prevalence of micronutrient deficiencies. We have to understand the enabling environment for fortification, the availability and supply chain for pulses, both at global and country level. And availability here considers all of the aspects: domestic production, imports, exports, and global trade dimensions. Then industry mapping is also important in terms of assessing current infrastructure, capacity and processes, potential delivery platforms that we could leverage to reach people with fortified pulses, close to actual consumption of different types of pulses in different countries, and consumer behaviors and perceptions for washing, cooking, purchasing, and storing pulses. And while reviewing these factors along the program impact pathway for fortification, we can't go in the chronological order the way the pathway has been designed. We have to assess these factors across multiple stages at the same time to explore the true potential of the intervention. And all of this information is going to help us in undertaking costing analysis and also assess comprehensive public health, human capital, and economic impacts for the intervention, which is also going to help the governments and other stakeholders make decisions along the program impact pathway.
You have 2 minutes, Manpreet.
This is my last slide, Jalal. Thank you so much. Here, I want to present to you the need to undertake a comprehensive scoping assessment to collect information on these crucial factors that have been placed on the left side, and that will help us reach critical decision points for pulses fortification presented on the right side of the slide. This two-phased assessment considers analyzing mainly quantitative factors at global level in phase 1 that will help us make critical decisions about country pulse combination and what business and operational models really make sense in those particular countries and at global level. Phase 2 is more about collecting qualitative indicators and doing a deep dive into the countries of interest, and then making decisions about relevant delivery platforms, appropriate technology to fortify pulses, with making decisions about the studies and trials that need to be undertaken to generate evidence, and the kind of partnerships and collaborations needed to take the intervention from design to scale. It is important to note that the timelines to complete all of these steps, collecting landscape information and actually reaching these critical decision points, it's going to take time, and all of these tasks could vary depending upon different country contexts. At Nutrition International, pulses fortification is a critical component of our fortification strategy, and we are committed to understanding the global landscape thoroughly to be able to come up with a strong program design and plan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Manpreet. That was a great presentation. And thank you for providing us with an overview of pulse fortification and bringing forward the critical aspects that we need to consider in designing fortification program. Thank you again. It is now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Albert Vandenberg. Dr. Vandenberg is a professor in the Department of Plant Sciences at the University of Saskatchewan. He holds the NSERC SPG Industrial Research Chair in Genetic Improvement of Lentils. He is involved in a wide range of local and international crop development research and collaboration activities in the disciplines of agriculture, food, and nutrition. Dr. Vandenberg, the floor is yours now.
Okay, thank you, Jalal. Could I get the next slide, please? That's the title. So let me just start off by saying that pulses are kind of unique, not just from the nutritional perspective, but also from the environmental perspective. You can see on this slide, this is one of lots of information that's coming out now. Whatever we look at, greenhouse gases, land use, water use profiles, pulses are actually very beneficial in comparison to all other sources of protein, not to mention that the protein level is actually higher. And so it's good to see the increasing focus on plant-based proteins. One of the reasons that lentil in particular is being used is that it's an ingredient in plant-based diets, of course, but it's also very quick cooking, and that makes it, it has additional culinary perspective that also leads to lower cost and a better environmental profile. Of course, the issue always has been in all grains, really, is that what plants are using to protect themselves, things like phytic acid, tannins, and polyphenols, also binds up the iron, and that iron is non-heme, and therefore it has lower bioavailability. From a Canadian perspective, over the last 50 years, lentil came from being introduced to now we are now the world's largest producer and the largest trader by far. So we're probably producing somewhere between 40 and 45% of the lentils every year. And so as the crop grew, we started to get more interested in some of the science parts. And so about 10 years ago, people were very interested in biofortification. So we jumped on the train and we started looking at, what's in lentils here in Saskatchewan in particular. So yes, iron and zinc, relatively high compared to many other plant-based foods. However, one of the interesting things was that in this particular environment, selenium is also abundant in the soil, and therefore it's also is taken up in lentils. So we kind of started off looking just at the science of the agronomy and so on. Then we started looking at bioavailability. And of course, the iron was not available as much as people were expecting in the biofortification side. So we basically decided that at that stage, we would start focusing on doing the fortification. So we have been working at this since about 2014. So a little bit about the selenium. In the last 5 years, we completed a study that shows that one of the hypotheses in the toxicology of arsenic was that selenium is antagonistic with it. And so there's a group that was based in Bangladesh and in Canada that took a look at this, and they've published something fairly recently which shows that when people that are affected by arsenic start eating lentils that have a high level of selenium, and selenium is unique in the sense that most continents don't have it in their soils. So it's kind of a Canadian thing, which made us interested here. What we found was that selenium actually is antagonistic to arsenic and starts leaving the body, and we start to see signs of clinical improvement in health. How does that manifest itself? Reduced body burden of arsenic. Arsenic gets excreted in urine, not through the stool, and there's a series of improved health measures that we were able to show. And of course, this is now leading us towards a much longer term, larger scale study. Let's take a look at iron. We're doing a similar thing with iron, where in this case, we started off saying, okay, we're going to use iron biofortified lentils, but we switched that to looking at really fortified lentils. So we've done a little bit of work in Bangladesh. Yunus Fakir, Diane Delaval, and our host Jalal was involved in this type of work. And so we've looked at what happens when you feed fortified lentils to adolescent girls in Bangladesh. Most of the take-home messages here are positive, well, actually all of them. So anemia is prevalent in teenage girls in Bangladesh. We were able to increase serum ferritin levels through a diet of fortified lentils. And compared to the control, you can see down below, 60% lower chance of developing signs of IDA, lower chance of developing clinical iron deficiency anemia, and 70% chance of developing lower chances of developing subclinical IDA. So all the arrows are pointing in the right direction for this as a method to actually deal with iron insufficiency. So just to note, this type of stuff is going to be published over the next year. So this led us, like I said, this led us to, once we started working with iron, we said, well, why don't we go with zinc as well? So we're now looking at dual fortification. So we're able to use dual fortified products to increase iron and zinc. It seems to work quite well. We've published most of this information. It was sensory acceptability was fine. That's also been published. So there's a series of related publications that everyone can look up later, but no problem with sensory acceptability. And when we looked at bioavailability, iron and zinc together, it was actually a synergistic effect. You can see here iron more than quadrupled. And when we looked at the CACO test results for relative bioavailability, so this is also about to be published. This is going to be the next step. We're going to look at hot extrusion technology to not just add iron and zinc, but look at the whole complement of minerals and vitamins that could be available. We think that this will, this is our latest focus of research here, is to try and make fortified lentils much as is being done with fortified rice. Thank you. And these are some of the supporting organizations. So thank you to all the organizations that have contributed to this.
Thank you, Dr. Burke. This was a very informative presentation. And thank you for bringing us to the critical evidence that brought lentils at the verge of scaling up, which we're seeing now. And also for shedding light on the future opportunities that Pulse's fortification is offering. Now I'd like to introduce you to our last speaker, Corinne Ringholz. Corinne serves as the fortification advisor for the nutrition division at the World Food Program in Rome, Italy. Corinne is an epidemiologist and has a wealth of experience of working across several US government organizations in a variety of roles, particularly contributing to technology and innovation. Over to you, Corinne.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. As mentioned, my name is Corinne Ringholz, and yes, as an epidemiologist, I do find this nexus between nutrition and public health and the role that fortification has to play particularly interesting. For those of you who don't know WFP yet, just a quick note, though we are typically known for our work in emergencies, WFP also has a mandate to strengthen the resilience of peoples and communities affected by protracted crises by applying a development lens in our humanitarian response, which is where a lot of our work in fortification comes to play. Okay, so we've heard a lot about Pulse's fortification. What I'd like to do in the next few minutes is to raise some of the key considerations for rice fortification that could be useful for Pulses as well. Firstly, I'd like to flag that rice fortification has taken a lot of time to get scaled up. This timeline shows some of the key milestones in rice fortification. The blue boxes show technology, yellow shows when mandatory legislation was passed, green shows technical consultation and guidelines, and orange shows how we are working to fortify, to scale up fortified rice globally. So you'll see that the beginning of modern rice fortification technology dates back to the 1940s with the coating technology. Soon after this, the Philippines passed mandatory legislation on rice fortification, but it wasn't until the 1990s and 2000s that extrusion was developed, which I'll explain in my next slide. With various studies showing impact on acceptability and feasibility, there's been growing interest in rice fortification within both social safety nets as well as through retail channels. What I'd like to flag here is how can we build upon the existing momentum for fortified staples and use this to bring fortified pulses to scale at a more rapid pace than what we've seen with rice. At WFP, we do consider ourselves to be technology agnostic when it comes to rice fortification, but there are essentially two ways to fortify rice that we consider acceptable for our target populations. Either rinse-resistant coating, much like what we've heard about lentils, except that the micronutrients are unable to be washed away in large amounts, which is critical for so many of our beneficiaries who either soak the rice or rinse it, sometimes multiple times before cooking it, or extrusion. So what I've illustrated here is how we fortify rice with extruded fortified rice kernels. For those of you who aren't familiar with this process with rice, it basically involves taking the leftover bits of rice, following the milling process, grinding them into a flour, adding the fortificants of interest, and then putting this mixture through a machine, much like a pasta maker, to make kernels the size and shape of our choosing. In this way, we can match the locally consumed rice, whether it be long, medium, or short grain, so that once a fortified kernel is blended with the standard unfortified rice, it's nearly impossible to detect any differences. This is critical if we are not coupling the intervention with a very robust SBCC campaign, and it will also be essential to consider in the fortification of pulses. While we actively promote both biofortification and post-harvest fortification at WFP, one of the benefits of post-harvest fortification is that we can fortify with multiple micronutrients, which is essential to a cost-effective and nutritionally impactful program. Although any given country can set its own standard, there are more or less 8 vitamins and minerals consistently used to fortified rice, some for public health significance and some for restoring the levels lost during the milling process. Finally, it's important to note that the effectiveness of any given fortification program depends on a number of factors, ranging from the packaging and storage to bioavailability and absorption by the target population. The factors that impact this effectiveness are critical to assess in advance of implementing any program and then to tailor those programs accordingly. So these same factors will be necessary to consider when looking at pulses. This slide I just will go over very quickly. I just want to use it to show the power of fortifying rice with multiple micronutrients to help reach the RNI, or the intake amount for any given micronutrient to meet the requirements essentially of 97.5% of the target population. In this case, you can see how simply substituting the rice that school children are already receiving in their school lunches with fortified rice, how this can help us reach our goal of getting to 50% of many of these micronutrients in our school feeding programs. So again, I know that iron and zinc have been studied a lot with pulses, but following the studies of additional micronutrients, we're going to be able to optimize the recommended levels of fortificants for pulses fortification. So just something to bear in mind how quickly that can impact what our beneficiaries are receiving. Something else I want to flag when considering where to implement is when determining where to implement our rice fortification programs, we look for places where there's great overlap of high rates of micronutrient deficiencies as well as high rates of rice consumption. It's important to note that for rice, we never seek to increase rice consumption, but rather to replace the unfortified rice that people already eat with fortified rice. And again, we usually aim for 75 grams per day per person or higher when looking at these different options. This helps us to ensure that people will consume sufficient rice to benefit from the fortificants. However, again, it's important to flag that for pulses, they might not be bound to the same parameter of not looking to increase consumption. So this is something that when programming for pulses might be able to take a very different approach. again, once we've decided to move forward with rice fortification, we take a look at the different potential regulatory frameworks and the different delivery options to determine what would be the best fit for any given context. Just to flag, there's two different regulatory frameworks we look at. One is mandatory fortification, which indicates that it's required by national law that the commodity is fortified. Usually, they do. Fortification standards exist, and normally there should be enforcement. In the case of voluntary fortification or market-driven fortification, it is not mandated by law, but rather it's up to the producer to voluntarily fortify the commodity. Standards and government monitoring is useful in order to ensure that labeling is correct and the laboratories have the capacity to test it, etc. But it's not always as well regulated as with mandatory fortification. In terms Okay, thank you. In terms of the different modalities that we can use to implement, we can use these social safety nets. Again, we've seen this a lot especially with COVID. It's a targeted approach to reach the most vulnerable population groups. We do this with school feeding programs, for example, where rice can be distributed to those living in poverty and as food aid during national disasters or emergencies. Retail, on the other hand, up and coming, for example, we can see this in Bangladesh, where fortified rice has only just come into the commercial market for the first time and can be implemented much like social safety nets under either framework. But however, retail works best when there's a very strong SBCC campaign, and also there has to already be demand for the food, where we're not quite so bound with the social safety nets in that way. So again, you can see here how we can think about using this with pulses. The last thing I want to flag just is that there's already been a vast amount of work to show the effectiveness of rice fortification, of other staple food fortification. Often when we go into any given country, the government wants to see anything ranging from feasibility to acceptability to retention studies. And in order to scale up pulses fortification, it's going to be necessary to continue to build up the evidence base, showing not only the impact of the fortification of pulses, but the indirect benefits on the overall value chain and larger food system as well, if you want to get that local buy-in. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Corinne. That was a very engaging presentation, and thank you for reflecting on your rice fortification experience on guiding the future of pulse fortification. And I would also like to thank all the presenters for being very much within the time frame. It is now time to move to the panel discussion, but I can see that a lot of questions are starting to come in, and the audience will soon have time to interact with our panelists and the presenters. And so there's still time for you to type questions in the question box, and we will soon come to you for a question and answer session. As we receive more questions, let us turn to the panelists to hear their expert opinions and reflections on the presentations. I want to now first introduce our distinguished panelists before we go to the questions. Let me start by introducing Dr. Mandana Rabi. Dr. Mandana is the Vice President, Global Technical Services and Chief Technical Advisor at Nutrition International. She oversees the technical quality of Nutrition International's program and leads a global team of experts to address most challenging gaps in evidence and practice to improve nutrition of the vulnerable populations. She has a wealth of experience in nutrition policy, programming, and research, and have had leading roles in different international organizations during her past career. Then we have Yannick Foyne. Thank you for joining from Singapore. I know it is very late there. Yannick is a molecular biologist and a public health expert. He is currently leading DSM's Nutrition Improvement Unit as the Global Director, with a mission to positively impact public health by developing and implementing effective and affordable nutrition solutions, leveraging their expertise and cross-sector partnerships to reach low-income consumers and beneficiaries. Next, we have Dr. Mustafizur Rahman, who is also joining from Bangladesh. Thank you. Dr. Rahman is the Line Director, National Nutrition Services at the Institute of Public Health Nutrition in Bangladesh. This is under the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Government of Bangladesh. He is the key player in taking public health and nutrition evidence to government actions and providing the government of Bangladesh with technical directions as well as directions in nutrition policies and decision makings. I'm also delighted to say that Dr. Rahman also led Nutrition International Bangladesh country office for a number of years in the past. Then we have Irfan Ahmed. Irfan is the Director of Strategy at Nutrition International. He has been instrumental in the development of a number of strategies for Nutrition International in the recent past. Prior to joining Nutrition International, he worked in strategy consulting, advising global foundations, private companies, governments, and nonprofit organizations in a variety of sectors, including healthcare, education, and economic development. Irfan has also worked within the UN system and in grassroots advocacy. Next, we have Dr. David Pelletier. Dr. David is a professor of nutrition policy in the Division of Nutritional Sciences at Cornell University. His research, teaching, and public engagement focuses on improved methods for analysis, design, and implementation of nutrition policy and programs, and tools for scaling up nutrition interventions and applications of implementation science in nutrition. He served as the president of the Society for Implementation Science in Nutrition in its first 4 years and is now the current past president. Then we have Anne Whittivan. Anne is the vice president of program operations at Nutrition International. Her role includes leadership of Nutrition International's technical support to the Food Fortification program in Pakistan, which supports wheat flour and well fortification, and also led Nutrition International's Right Start program that included diverse fortification activities in Asia and Africa that features wheat, rice, and maize, as well as other food vehicles. My colleague Manpreet and I will ask 2 questions to each of you. We will have 2 minutes. You will have 2 minutes to answer them. So let's begin the question session. And I would like to start off with asking 2 questions to Mandana first. Mandana, Manpreet presented some key considerations along the program pathway for pulses fortification as an intervention. Can you talk about the significance of this kind of thinking for Nutrition International? And also, how do you plan to incorporate it in the planning and programming? Over to you, Mandana.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Jalal, for the introductions, and to all the panelists for being here today. Yeah, I mean, just reflecting a little bit on our programming and how this approach, implementation science-focused, evidence-to-action-focused approach will serve our work. You know, we are dedicated to improving nutrition, especially for those most in need, the vulnerable populations, women, adolescents, and young girls, and children who are main target populations for us. And we want to eventually change nutrition indicators such as stunting and growth indicators such as anemia, especially nutritional anemia, in these populations. And in order to do so, then we want to have an optimal mix of interventions that are proven to have an impact on these outcomes. And for that, then we can't just have one solution, you know, vertical interventions, one size fits all approaches. We actually need to do exactly what Manpreet showed us, which is really multiple types of assessments in-depth looking at what's the context, and then bringing that information into a really nice framework for thinking about solutions, and then doing a kind of fit-based analysis saying, okay, so in this context, based on the behaviors of consumers, based on the availability and the environment, these are the solutions that would make sense. And then we will use an approach, the implementation science approach, for a stepwise implementation, making sure that we understand how we go from point A to point B, and we really are able to make changes and shift in our programming in the right time, so that it's not that 5 years passed and we're at the end of a project and then we have the lessons coming. So this is about also continuous improvement. And because of that, I feel that this kind of linking the more, I guess, academic and conceptual thinking of implementation science to a very pragmatic, program-focused approach of Nutrition International and similar organizations could have a lot of benefits, and also allow us to formulate a lot of the learnings from the practical side of things and bring it back to the academic and the conceptual side of the work as well. So it's about making these two connections from evidence to action, most of all, from my perspective.
Thank you very much. Thank you. This was very enlightening. The second question to you would be, considering that we have multiple technology in place for fortifying pulses, what are the contextual considerations that you need to keep in mind while choosing the most appropriate option?
Thank you. So I guess, just reflecting on my own career and how I have worked within fortification programs, I started my career as a nutrition advisor in my country in Iran, with looking at opportunities for fortification with iron and folate for staples and what would make sense. And, you have to really look at a lot of different factors. Some are health and public health oriented and some are not. Some are about the economics of it, the consumer acceptance and behavior, even the organoleptics and taste and color changes. So any kind of changes in really the usual diets of consumers needs to have that kind of thorough thinking. Otherwise, you will have with the best solution that from a health perspective might be quite nice and nutritionally quite adequate, but then it wouldn't be accepted or wouldn't be sustainable to roll out. So I think those considerations, again, with pulses fortification, as it was presented by our presenters today, have all of, from the science side, but also from the practice, economics, applicability of it have to come into consideration. In general, I think with fortification, perhaps, again, reflecting back on the past 20, 30 years of experience, I think there has been the industry focus, the kind of supply side of things, the design of the best rollout of the best way of fortifying the supply. And then there has been the consumer, the demand side of things, and how this is being received and rolled out, especially with the poor populations and how they're accessing these fortified products. I think as the nutrition community, we have to do a much better job of linking these two together. It's not about just fortifying and counting how many tons of, staples or food we have fortified. It's also about trying to see where this is going, and are we able to come up with ways to channel these fortified, higher quality, higher nutrient products to those who are most in need. Again, for Nutrition International, this concept of looking at social safety net programs and really facilitating the access of the poor to fortified products is a huge focus. And I think that's something that, especially in the context of COVID and additional vulnerabilities, would provide a lot of potential opportunities for making sure that these interventions are also available to those most in need.
Thank you, Mandana. And I also think we'll have to be thinking about many different type of pulses that are available there. So we'll have to take that into context in thinking about moving forward with fortification. Okay, now over to Yannick. I have 2 questions for you as well, 2 minutes for each to answer. The first question is regarding DSM has been historically engaging in with public sector. So can you talk more about DSM's intent as well as approach in terms of making the right insider business case to promote pulse fortification in particular?
Sure, happy to do that. Thanks, Jalal, and thanks everyone for the invitation. So at DSM, I mean, we indeed do work closely with partners like NI and WFP to increase access to healthy and affordable nutritious solutions for people who need them the most. And I believe that we are now in the critical window of opportunity to create sustainable systemic change, as we now see a significant increase of consumption of staple foods because of budget reasons, obviously. And as was shared earlier, I mean, even though such foods may contain sufficient calories, they typically lack the critical vitamins and minerals that you need for like vitamin A, vitamin D, zinc, iron, that are really necessary for good immunity. That has been proven to be so critical at this point in time. So many staples are already fortified, as was highlighted earlier. I mean, rice, maize, wheat flour, salt, and oil. And even though we, as a global nutrition community, I believe we still have work to do to increase coverage and also to raise awareness of the benefits of fortifying these staples, I do believe fortifying pulses is a very interesting opportunity to look at as well. Why? I think because first, they are consumed in many parts of the world, from Asia to Africa. And as Corinne mentioned earlier, it's similar to rice. I mean, they are consumed in areas where you also have at the same time high-level deficiencies. Pulses are also relatively affordable. They are accepted throughout the socio-economic pyramid as a healthy food. And they also contribute significantly to filling the protein gap as well. Last, they are also aspirational, in the sense that lentils and other pulses are really a key component of a plant-based diet. And as Bert mentioned, I mean, this is becoming increasingly popular everywhere in the world. So fortified lentils could really bring essential nutrients not only through social safety nets such as school feeding program, but also then through traditional retail, as I believe that consumers may be willing to pay for this healthy fortified vehicle. And for us at DSM and the industry, I mean, we do believe that we have a role to play, and we can contribute by sharing our technical expertise and innovation, and also our understanding of the consumer needs, as we can't forget that consumer needs to be at the center here. So I think the business case, as you asked, Jalal, I mean, it's rather clear, as you have first an affordable staple, which could be technically fortified, consumed in areas of high level of deficiencies, well accepted as a healthy carrier of protein, as well as interested industry partners which are willing to support. So what are we waiting for, basically?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for a good answer to this. I want to go to the next question for you. As you know, in Corinne's presentation, she mentioned her experience with rice fortification and how those can be applied to pulse fortification. So from the industry point of view, what are the key critical considerations that you'd like to have to highlight pulse fortification as an intervention?
Great question, Jalal. So as some of you may know, I mean, DSM has pioneered years ago what is now one of the most widely used technology to bring back essential nutrients into rice post-harvesting, and that's hot extrusion. And we do believe that the same technology could be used to also develop fortified lentils. So there's obviously a lot that we can learn from rice fortification, from the technology angle all the way to the value chain and also distribution channels. But maybe just to list a few points. So I do think that we need to ensure first that fortified lentils will be affordable. So meaning that we need to look carefully at what makes most sense in terms of cost at each step of the fortification value chain, from where the lentils are produced, where they could be processed or transformed into fortified lentils, all the way to where they will be consumed by consumers or beneficiaries. And of course, I mean, demand creation and SBCC activities will really be key to bring costs down, as they will help to reach scale with the intervention. Second, I mean, they need to be accepted and aspirational. As I said earlier, I mean, we need to put consumer or beneficiary at the center here. Consumers typically do not buy nutrition, they buy taste. And if we can develop the most nutritious product, like fortified pulses, but if consumers do not want it because they don't like the taste, they don't like the packaging, you name it, they won't accept it or even consume it or even buy it. So we need to bring them on board from the start. We need to innovate together with the consumer, actually with the citizen. And we need to not only ensure that fortified lentils will look, cook, and taste exactly like normal lentils, but they are safe, tasty, nutritious, and affordable. But that they also come with a message which is aspirational, and also that they are accessible to low-income consumers. So we need to innovate both on the product side, but also on business model and distribution channels. And last point, maybe if you allow me, I think we need to ensure that industry is on board and has also incentives to produce high quality, affordable, and safe fortified pulses, which will then have a public health impact. At DSM, we believe that poor quality fortification is actually very expensive. And this is where the industry has a clear role to play, and I think it's actually rather a duty than a role. So we need to continuously, as a global nutrition community, relentlessly advocate for quality fortification. If you don't have quality fortification, you're pretty much harming the poorest and wasting money. So I don't think lentil fortification will be a silver bullet, but it's still an effective, scalable, and low-cost solution to really improve levels of nutrition on a broader scale, particularly in low to middle-income countries. So if we make fortified lentils available to low to middle-income consumers and beneficiaries, I think we can really elevate access to micronutrients essential for strengthening immunity to the whole population. So,
thank you very much. I really liked your industry and business perspective channeling through nutrition lenses or nutrition pipeline. So this was really great. Next, I wanted to come to Dr. Mustafizur Rahman. So there are two questions again for Dr. Mustafiz, and you'll have 2 minutes for each. So first question is, we all are allies in exploring the potential for pulse fortification as a public health strategy. What would you consider as the key elements for a government of Bangladesh in particular, that need to be in place to set the right environment to promote and scale up pulse fortification? Dr. Mustafiz.
Can you listen me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Thanks to all the presenters. And I have learned a lot from these presentations. And your question is, what are the key elements? And question number one, that needs to be the place to set the right environment to promote and scale up pulse fortification. The fortification started in the early 90s with the iodine in the salt. Now we have fortification in the edible oil, we have fortification in the fortified rice and the wheat, and we have fortification in many components that I have already included, and those are really of the safety net program. Bangladesh has 23 ministry has the 123 safety net programs. We can easily use those things. And our concern is very simple. And that simple is we need a evidence-based proven documents for the Bangladesh. In the presentation, I got some of them. But if I go for the pulse fortification, we need some evidence. Number one. Number two concern is very simple. When we started the fortification of the salt with the potassium iodide, then we found that the cost of the initial one and cost after the fortification it was 4 times higher than the normal fortification. SBCC is important always because this campaign is important. Otherwise, people will be confused. Okay, whether the pulse is really important for this issue or not, and whether it is safe, whether it will be accepted by the people or not. And environment, I will not go for the policy because there is a very good fortification policy in the country, and country is suffering from different types of micronutrient deficiency, and this is one of the important vehicle, pulse or lentil, whatever you can call, one of the important vehicle for our country. And we are really suffering because we have developed from if you go with the Bangladesh demographic health survey from 2007 up to the 2017, we have improved a lot. It was a bit disturbed by the pandemic, but we are in good shape after the July. So cost is an important issue, proven or evidence-based is an important issue, safe is another important issue, accepted by the government, not public. It also important, but we can overcome that one by aggressive social and behavioral science communication and a strong comprehensive fortification policy is already taken, so we can go ahead with this one. Over.
Thank you, Dr. Mustafiz. That was very, very enlightening. So the second question to you is, given the government of Bangladesh's experience with the fortification of rice, salt, oil, and other foods, what are some of the non-health sector challenges that you may anticipate for pulse fortification to go at scale?
Thank you. Basically, in Bangladesh, fortification is now becoming popular. And the public sector and the private sector basically are working together. And if we consider the fortification of the other successfully fortified food, we have seen government is ready to allow all these things, and private sector are becoming more involved because with this fortification they have found okay, it is effective. Number one, because diversification of the food, number one, household fortification, as well as the industry level fortification. Government, Ministry of the Industry, they are really interested to do all these things. But I think for pulse fortification, what are the technology related preparedness of the country, that is important. That is almost there. Maybe kernel related issue what we use for the rice fortification, maybe some of the items we need to import from the other side, and control of the price is important, and import related things and other things also important, and what will be the modality, those are important. Otherwise Bangladesh is ready to minimize the macronutrient related deficiency, and for that we can go for the dietary diversification, we can go for the food related diversification of the food, as well as we need the balanced diet. Our diet habit, as Bangladeshi, we take food from the point of the taste, not from the point of the balanced diet. So in that case, we need to do some advocacy and others important policy. We need to do like other successfully fortified things. This is really in favor because government has already approved the nutrition policy, already approved the fortification related policy. So I think we can do it, but probably we need a small scale piloting so that government will go for the expansion. Over. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mustafiz. Actually, this is very exciting for those of us who are working on fortification, to know that the government of Bangladesh has the willingness to accept it and move forward with the fortified pulses. And thank you for being here at this late.
Just one point, because Bangladeshi people, they usually like to take rice and they usually like to take lentil in everyday meal. So this is one of the important vehicle to minimize the macronutrient related deficiency, especially for the anemia. So over.
Even more encouraging for us. And now I would like to hand over to my colleague Manpreet to ask questions to the next three panelists. Manpreet, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jalal. I think this is a good segue into the strategy and program planning and some programming discussions altogether. So I'd like to start with you, Irfan. You are a business strategist. What do you think about the development of some intervention-specific strategies? And are there any common principles that you could suggest across intervention type scenarios?
Thanks so much, Manpreet, for that question, and great to be here with everyone. So I think if you think of intervention strategies as broad guidance and parameters for the teams that are actually going to be doing the work, then I think maybe there are three principles or considerations that I'd share. The first is about setting a true north and being really clear about the objectives. And while it seems really obvious, I think the pitfall to avoid with intervention-specific strategies is becoming a solution looking for a problem, right? And be that something like lentils fortification or any other interventions, there's always sometimes a tendency to say, I've got the solution, let me now try to scale this up everywhere and anywhere. And I think your presentation, Manpreet, and Mandana's interventions, a lot of what you shared about was making sure that, we're doing the public health analysis, we're finding the right locations and the right settings to do this work in, right? So having that true north is, I think, the first one. The second is about, when you have that true north, and to stick with the navigation analogy, I think the strategies are really meant to be compasses, not maps, right? So the settings in which these interventions have to be deployed, they're not only technically complicated and challenging, they're often politically complicated and challenging. There's economics involved, right? So there's so many considerations that you really can't have this linear plan that you think is going to work in all circumstances at all times, right? So what you're really trying to do is, I think, arm teams with the compass that helps them navigate those different challenges rather than stick to a routine path. And the last one is, I think, something that cuts in somewhat the opposite direction, that even though you're kind of using it as a compass, not as a map, you do want to the extent possible, try to rule some things out, right? So, you could rule it out either for organizational reasons, because you think there's a different partner who's better positioned than you to do that. You could rule it out because you think it's not the highest ROI. But again, when doing intervention-specific strategies, I think spending a lot of time saying, this is what we will do and this is what we will not do is equally valuable. So those would be kind of the three considerations I'd share.
Very interesting three considerations: true north, compass, not map, and prioritize and rule out what you can't do and shouldn't do. So I think very, very interesting. This actually takes me to my next question, Irfan. For organizations such as Nutrition International that have an impact-focused and impact-first mandate, how should we include research and development components within the intervention strategies, and what should be considered there?
I think very similar to what I shared earlier, I think for us at NI in particular, as an impact-focused organization, the starting point always is, why are we doing R&D, right? And Mandana has mentioned this earlier as well. NI at Nutrition International, we really see ourselves as serving as a bridge between evidence and action at scale. So for us, whenever we think about including an R&D component within an intervention strategy, it always starts with, where do we ultimately want this to end up in terms of impact? And I think that's why something like lentils or pulses fortification feels so right and appropriate for us, because, as you presented as well, we've got a clear view of where we want to go with it and how we think we can get this to scale. So I think that's kind of the main thing to keep in mind. The only other thing perhaps that I'd add to that is, unlike many other aspects of intervention strategies, with the R&D component, it's also important to set expectations both internally and with our donors and other partners. Because as you know, R&D is inherently less certain. It's got a longer pathway and impact to scale. I think Karine shared kind of some of the pathways of all the different evidences that need to be built up before you can actually even convince a government to do something. So just given that, I think it's important to be honest with ourselves and our partners and say, this is what we're getting into. This is why we're doing it, but this is also how we should think about it differently than, say, a more straightforward service delivery intervention. So I think those are some of the key things that we try to keep in mind. Thanks.
Very insightful. Bridging evidence to action and laying that out. Thank you so much, Irfan. Moving to you, Dr. David. Talking about fortified red lentils as a specific example, and Dr. Burt has talked about it, which is currently, I would say, at the stage of program planning. What are the key implementation research questions that one would need to answer to improve implementation effectiveness going forward?
Thank you, Manpreet. Actually, I think you and many of the speakers have already indicated what some of those research questions would be. Taking from your own presentation, Manpreet, you suggested 5 W questions and 1 H question: the why, the what, the who, the when, the where, and the how. And I think thinking of this in operationalizing these questions, it's important to think of this as a system that involves 3 broad components: what's happening at the population level, what's the state of the enabling environment, And what's the state of the, quote, delivery system that's in place for pulse fortification? So if I could just sort of elaborate on each of those. Clearly at the population level, it's important to know what the micronutrient status and deficiencies are in the country. Along with that, knowing something about the contribution of dietary deficiencies to the micronutrient deficiencies, and having access to good population dietary data. So that there's good knowledge of current consumer behavior, and with respect to the pulses in particular, knowing what the current or potential consumer acceptance might be for the fortified product, and the potential to increase that acceptance at that consumption, especially among the vulnerable groups. With respect to the enabling environment, a number of speakers have already pointed out the importance of legislation and standards and the capacity for compliance and enforcement. What's the current state of partnerships? Importantly, at the outset, what's the state of the social behavior change capacity in the country from the government side and as well as from NGOs and other partners? And then, of course, a big piece of this system is the delivery system. So having good knowledge and understanding of the structure of the industry, the balance of domestic production versus imports, and so on. Relatedly, the potential delivery platforms, not only from the commercial side, but also from the social protection side. So if I could just elaborate a little bit on one aspect of this to reveal the detail that's required. Some of the common barriers to compliance, which is critical in an ongoing fashion, is to have a mechanism for assessing compliance and for enforcement. On the public sector side, there's often a perceived risk of taking action against industries. There's often a lack of trained inspectors and laboratory analysts. There's often confusion over overlapping roles among different government agencies, lack of financing, and so on. And on the private sector side, there's likewise perhaps poor understanding and clarity about regulations and standards, willingness in the first place to go down this road, uncertainty about market demand and competition with producers who do not fortify if it's not mandate, and so on. So again, think of this as a system with 3 large components, and implementation research is just riddled throughout the whole system. So it's important to have good research partners, very practical, embedded research partners as part of the stakeholder group going forward.
Thank you, Dr. David. Very important points about understanding and operationalizing critical concerns across 3 different platforms, the population level at different levels, population level, enabling environment, and delivery level. Very, very important. Moving forward, my next question to you, Dr. David, is effective researcher-implementer collaboration is a key element in evidence-based program designing, learning, improvement of program implementation, and evaluation, all of those components. For pulses fortification, particularly as an intervention, what steps would you suggest to bring together all relevant stakeholders for these processes?
Okay, thank you, Manpreet. I certainly agree that this is a key element, is that collaboration and close communication and understanding between the researchers and the many other stakeholders. One of the things that's impressive about the fortification space is that there's an unusual level of diversity in the types of stakeholders that need to be effectively engaged compared to other types of nutrition interventions. So in addition to the researchers themselves, this obviously includes ministry officials responsible for food standards, food safety and labeling, the compliance and enforcement, food processors, premix suppliers, the government departments responsible for consumer education and social marketing, along with consumer organizations and commercial marketers, donors, UN agencies, and international technical agencies. It's an overwhelming or very impressive set of stakeholders that do need to be engaged effectively. So clearly at the national level, something like a national fortification alliance that can bring representatives from all of these stakeholder groups would be instrumental, but also then the capacity for a core group of supporters of the initiative to be able to work more intensively with certain subgroups of these stakeholders as required as the whole initiative rolls out.
Thank you so much, Dr. David. Comprehensively planning collaboration among all relevant stakeholders. I really take that as a key message from your response. Thank you so much. Moving on to the last panelist of this session. And talking about the principles of implementation research that has been talked about by other presenters and panelists, but especially by Dr. David right now. What do you think is the application or utility of this kind of an understanding, implementation research understanding, to help take an intervention from innovation to scale?
Implementation research can be super helpful in trying to design a program. It's going to give us a clear program pathway, a blueprint to follow, and it's really going to help point out some of the pitfalls that we might find as we get into implementation at scale. I think David started to talk a little bit about how unique this kind of nutrition program is. It's food, right? So it's food, it's food technology, it's culture, it's science plus nutrition, but also even politics sometimes. And so all of these things interact, and implementing at scale then means that you've got to kind of juggle all of these things. But good quality implementation research will point out where the problems might be, where the pain points will be in terms of the implementation. What kinds of behavior change or awareness do you need to do? What are some of the opinions of the different key stakeholders in these groups? In one of the programs that we're implementing at scale in Pakistan, one of the things that has really challenged us is just the politics of wheat flour in the country and the political power that some of the associations, the wheat flour millers, have. And so good quality implementation research can help you know what those are in advance and then plan for them.
Very interesting, important components of implementation research and how to bring them together to actually help program planning. Very interesting. Last question for this panel discussion to you, Anne, is, from your experience with Nutrition International, you're the Director of Operations, what are some of the potential platforms that could be leveraged to reach a large number of people with fortified pulses? Considering this is just a new intervention, we are still exploring the scope. So what are those potential platforms?
For sure. And when we talk about scale in fortification, we really are talking about a big scale, right? We're not talking about thousands of people or tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands. We really want to reach millions of people, hundreds of millions of people, in order to get the kind of public health impact that's really going to make a difference to nutrition in a country. And so that means that we have to really think about platforms, as you've rightly said. Corinne in her presentation talked a little bit about this, and so did Yannick. But I think for NI, we really look at two main platforms. And one is a market-led platform that's based on mandatory fortification, so that you ensure a level playing field for all of your producers, that the price differential isn't going to make a difference, and that you get the largest amount of adequately fortified product into the market, so that everybody is purchasing a good quality product that's properly fortified at a reasonable price. And so that's one way to do it. The other way to do it, as a couple of presenters have mentioned, is through a social safety net program, where there's either a food ration as part of that program. In the case of Bangladesh, for example, where there's a rice as part of the vulnerable group feeding program. Or you could have even some of WFP's food aid, you could consider a social safety net program. It's providing food rations for disaster affected people. And school feeding as well as another type. So different kinds of social safety net programs also offer an opportunity to reach large numbers of people. These can be a little bit less price sensitive, which can be helpful. They can be very targeted, so that instead of reaching everybody, you're actually reaching more vulnerable people. And that can be a very useful thing in certain kinds of programs. And I would say that that just trying to link this back to the COVID pandemic, we have seen that social safety net programs actually have been really expanded as a way for governments to respond to the hardships caused by the pandemic. And so Nutrition International is really seeing that these can be programs, if we improve the quality of these programs by fortifying the food within them, or through some other means, that these can be a really great way of reaching large numbers of people with a low-cost, high-impact intervention that can improve nutrition. Thanks.
Great insights, and identifying platforms to make a dent in nutrition situation in the lives of tens and millions and large number of people, and mandatory fortification and social safety nets as a focus for organizations like NI. So thank you so much, and over to my colleague Jalal.
Thank you everybody, panelists and presenters. This has been very rich, but we only have about 10 minutes for the question and answer session. So I will jump into that right away. There are a lot of questions that has been added to the chat box, so given the time is limited, I thought we could lump them into different segments of questions, so that they can answer most of the, one answer should be applicable to most of the questions. This is about the extent of pulse fortification. So there's multiple questions related to whether or not this is going to be simply scale up of regular fortification as a program, or is it going to be under any emergency setting, or is it going to be both? So I would ask Mandana to respond to that.
Yeah, no, I was just saying that we have to do those assessments that were presented to identify under what conditions, in which populations the pulses do have a potential for reaching the most vulnerable and would be a good staple or good food item for fortification. So that still needs to be identified, and that's something that would be a new area for implementation research, so that within, let's say, a couple of years, we will be then in a position to make some more kind of strategic global recommendations for it. At this point, we are at the implementation research and exploration phase about the utility of pulse fortification as a public health intervention. So it's just the beginning.
Thank you, Mandana. There are questions related to cost of fortification, and I would actually ask both Bert and Yannick to respond to those. So the first part would be related to spray fortification. So Bert, if you could explain in terms of what the cost might look like, and if it is going to impact the vulnerable population, and then Yannick, on the hot extrusion, what would be the cost that may be applied to the consumers? Bert first, yes.
Well, we've only really done it at, say, a pilot scale. In discussions with industry partners who have lentil mills, which is where this kind of thing would be done, that's still a question that's being discussed. But I think it depends which technology you're going to use, of course. When we were looking at spray technology, I think we estimated something like it might cost $100,000 to put in the equipment. Technically speaking, it's not that difficult. In fact, for our studies in Bangladesh, where we had to ship container loads of lentils, we actually did it at a fairly large scale. So it's kind of a spray technology. And so scaling it up is not a big deal at a factory. When it gets to extrusion, this is more Yannick's area of expertise. We think that, well, I guess we'll be finding that out this year or next year. Once things settle down a little bit with the COVID thing and we can kind of get together, we're making plans behind the scenes to do this at a pilot scale with the food center. So, well,
yes, please. Yeah.
Sorry, Bert. No, and well, it's a difficult question for me to answer because we have not done, DSM and also all the partners here today, any cost assessment on using hot extrusion. But what I can share already, if you compare to the cost of fortifying rice, for instance, they are typically three types of components. Premix, obviously, so the mix of fortificants, which obviously depends on the formulation that is being used. The cost of raw materials. So in the case of rice, broken rice, rice flour. In the case of lentils, I would say lentil chips, I'm guessing, because we're going to be looking at byproducts of lentils to bring down the cost. And the last pillar is production cost. So those are the three different components, I would say, of the cost structure. And typically, when you fortify rice, you're looking at the cost increase of between 2 to 5%. And of course, as I said earlier, I mean, when you reach scale, cost goes down as well. So, but for lentils, to fortify lentils using hot extrusion, it's a bit too early to tell because we have not gone first through the technical feasibility, and then we'll be able to do a thorough cost assessment.
So there is one question related to the fortificant that we have used in I guess in the spray fortification, because the other has not been done yet. So Bert, if you could mention what element did you use as a fortificant for iron fortification?
So we tested different types. Iron EDTA was suitable, and that was that's all published information. So.
Okay, thank you. And then the next question would be related to washing. I would pose that to Manpreet. This is coming from multiple attendants. Actually, these are related to more focused to countries like Bangladesh and India, where washing is a big challenge in terms of keeping the micronutrients within the pulses. So, if you could shed a little bit of light on that, what is the key challenge, and are there ways to overcome that? Manpreet.
So this is a very important question, and we, right from the beginning, have been actually struggling to assess some of those components. We understand the technology that has been currently used to fortify lentils, red lentils with iron. With every wash, we are actually losing about 25 to 28% of the fortificant. That is known. So some of the, some of the strategies that we tried to apply, we wanted to understand why do people wash lentils so many times? Because there is lentil dust, we understood. So is there a way to reduce that lentil dust? First of all, if we want to continue with this technology, is there a way to reduce that lentil dust? Yes. Could we then fortify the red lentils with oil as a layer so that there is less lentil dust and then less washing? So that is something that has seemed to be promising. But moving on at scale, fortification is not an intervention that you really want to get into from the perspective of trying to make behavior change among consumers. We don't want to do that. So we want to assess for this particular technology, spray technology, coating that we're talking, what is the use? Because we do suspect that there going to be a reduction in cost element. Cost is going to look different when you use this technology versus hot extrusion. So for both the technologies, we are currently actually doing those kind of assessments. If we continue with spray, what context can these be applied, and what is going to be the cost implication? And with other contexts like India, Bangladesh, where washing is so prevalent, and going ahead with extrusion technology, hot extrusion, what are those critical components look like? Contextual considerations. So we really are considering all of those moving forward.
Okay, being mindful of time, I think only answer one more question, or maybe maximum two. But this is going to need to be very, very short answer. It might at the end go to Bert. Okay, so the question was related to the variety of pulses that are out there. So when we talk about pulse fortification, what is it that we're actually talking about? What do you think is the most the challenges that we might face when it comes to different type of pulses in different contexts?
Well, basically, we have to be looking at fortifying, pulses that are dehulled prior to consumption. So in theory, you could do that with chickpea, lentil. Not all pulses have the seed coat removed. For instance, phaseolus beans, the world's largest pulse crop. You're never going to be able to do that because you can't you can't really peel the skin off. So it has to be just particular types. I think lentil is kind of unique in that sense because it's a small seed. It's relatively easy to dehull once you have the material in place, and it has high enough value that you can justify it. Consumers all over the world are willing to pay more for lentil than they are for other pulses because they save in cooking time. It's pretty simple kitchen economics.
Great. Thank you. I think we're running out of time. We're already actually run out of time. So I would like to come to the closure of this webinar. But before that, I wanted to mention that I wanted to thank all the speakers as well as the panelists and all the attendees. And unfortunately, because we're running out of time, the questions that you have posed, these are very, very important ones. We would have them lumped, and we'll try to direct them to the panelists or the presenters who are more applicable to answer your questions. And then I will actually hand this over to Mandana, to bring her closing remarks. But even before we do this, please do interact with SISN and Nutrition International website, where we'll get more information. As you know, this webinar is going to be is recorded and is going to be available, and you will have an email from SISN with the links. So again, very, very much, very thank you to all the attendance participants and panelists and the presenters. Over to you, Manpreet, for the closing remarks.
Okay, thank you. I think that's to me. Thanks a lot, everyone. We are coming to the end of this webinar. I just wanted to, on behalf of the Nutrition International, my colleagues, to thank you all, to the presenters, to the panelists, and to the participants for being here today. As Jalal mentioned, we will have more events similar to this and on hopefully relevant topics in nutrition in future as well, and we will be sharing that information with the community. So looking forward to interacting with you in future as well. Thank you.